Hello students, let's spend some time today talking about decision making when it comes to the judicial branch. We're going to discuss how judges are picked, that important decision first off, and then we're going to talk about how judges make the decisions that they do when they rule on cases from the bench. So if you refer to your note organizer, the first two questions on it are questions that you should already know. Who is responsible for nominating federal judges, including Supreme Court justices? The nomination of judges at the federal level is done by the president. The second question, who is responsible for approving federal judges, including Supreme Court justices? The people that are nominated by the president to serve as federal judges or Supreme Court justices are approved by the Senate. So this sets up an interesting dynamic. Judges, as you might know, are not supposed to be biased or political, but this is really impossible because judges, like everybody else, are human, and they bring their own sort of human attitudes to their job. So even though we have this idea that judges are supposed to be completely fair and unbiased, there's actually a lot of politics that goes into the decisions that judges and Supreme Court justices make. There's a fairly consistent clue you can use to figure out where the ideology or the political views of a judge lies, and that is if you look at the president that appointed them, the president that nominated them. Chances are most judges will share the same ideology, either liberal or conservative, as the president that picked them. So this serves as a really good clue to figure out whether or not you're dealing with a conservative judge who might hold more conservative views that would be shared by, say, Republican politicians, or a liberal judge that holds liberal views that might be shared by Democratic Party politicians. So this can create situations on courts like the Supreme Court where you have a politically divided court. So the 9 judges that make up the Supreme Court, they are all going to come from their own backgrounds and their own viewpoints. Some of them are going to be conservative, some of them are going to be liberal, and this division is going to have a huge impact on how the court makes its decisions. So check out this this image here. It kind of symbolizes exactly what I'm talking about. This is the Supreme Court building, and you can see that half of it is blue and half of it is red, indicating that half of the justices on the Supreme Court are liberal and half of them are conservative, or somewhere close to it. This is a cartoon or imagery that sort of sums up that idea, that our Supreme Court is actually a very political institution, even though judges are not supposed to be. When a judge gets nominated by a president, they don't just automatically start serving at a federal court. They have to get confirmed, and the confirmation, as we mentioned at the beginning, is done by the Senate. What the Senate will do is they'll hold what's referred to as a confirmation hearing. This is essentially a job interview that the Senate conducts with the judicial candidate. During this interview, it's really important for the senators to figure out what the political views of that potential judge happen to be. So they'll ask a lot of pressing questions that sort of attempt to dig into the beliefs that judge holds. These are called litmus test questions. And if you remember litmus tests in science, it was a way to figure out if a substance was acidic or base, and you could stick a little piece of paper on something and it would change colors depending on what the substance was. Well, a litmus test question in a Senate confirmation hearing of a judge is kind of that same idea. You instead of touching the judge with a piece of paper, you're going to ask that judge questions that, given the judge's answer, you're going to know where their political leanings lie. So think about a controversial issue or an issue where conservatives think one way, liberals think the other way. Ask somebody that question, and their answer is going to tell you a lot about how they believe, how they think. And this is what senators are doing when they ask these litmus test questions. So before you continue with your notes, take a second right now, and in that last block on the first page of your notes, try and think up an example of a litmus test question. We'll discuss what you find, what you come up with in class. when judges are sitting on the bench and doing their job, they have to make a lot of important decisions as well. So let's talk about the decision-making process on the part of the judge or the judges in our courts. There's lots of things that can influence a judge's decision. Big thing, and the way that our court system in the United States works, is this concept of precedent. And precedent is essentially looking backwards at an earlier decision and using that as a guide for making a decision right now. So cases will come before a court, and there'll be some sort of monumental decision that's made on that, and that decision will be established as a precedent. That precedent will be the model that judges follow for years or decades or centuries to come. There's a term that I want you to be familiar with. It's called stare decisis. It's this term right here that you're noticing on your screen. What that means in Latin is let the decision stand. And what that means as a concept is this is the way that judges sort of practice this idea of precedent. They look back, they see the decision that was made in the past, and they let it stand. They let it stay. They let it keep going. So judges have to be really familiar with earlier decisions, earlier cases, how judges back then thought, and they can use those decisions to shape their own decisions in the present. This isn't to say that judges are always stuck. Let's say upholding a decision that was maybe thought to be appropriate, 100 years ago, but doesn't really work now. Judges can overturn decisions, and this is sort of the opposite of precedent, or establishing a new precedent. And when a judge overturns a decision, it can change things in a monumental way for the country. So judges hold a lot of power to either keep things going in the way that they're going by upholding a precedent, or turning things over and really making some big sweeping changes. If you remember studying history, there's some big sweeping changes in the history of the United States that are kind of ushered in by judges making decisions that either upheld the way things were going or overturned the way things were going. So this brings us to another important concept that has to do with judges and their attitude towards shaping society. That is two conflicting ideas called judicial activism and judicial restraint. So let's talk about those in the last few minutes that we have. So judicial activism is a term that we use to describe judges that really get political and really attempt to make changes with the decisions that they make. And sometimes these changes can be good things for the country or for people in general. Sometimes they can be bad things. Judicial activism as a term is also often kind of used as a negative term, and the reason why it ends up being used negatively is that we don't want judges to kind of shape the law. We just want them to interpret the law. So sometimes if people are disappointed with the way a court or a judge decided things because it's going to make big changes that they don't approve with, they might accuse a judge of practicing judicial activism, trying to decide a case in such a big way that it makes sweeping societal changes and shakes things up in a way that this person might not appreciate. We'll talk about this concept more in class. The flip side is judicial restraint. And judicial restraint is viewed as an attitude that judges, when they make decisions, should decide things just as narrowly as possible. And this means really focusing in on the issue at hand, making a decision that affects the people involved only and doesn't really create any kind of sweeping changes. So judicial restraint is something that people appreciate if they like the status quo. And as you can see from these images down below, that judicial activism, the opposite of judicial restraint, is again being portrayed in that negative view, which implies that judicial restraint for a lot of people is a good thing, but not necessarily. Because, and I want you to think about this in the last two questions in your notes, decisions that judges make can make big changes. Sometimes those changes can reshape society in great ways. And sometimes those changes can hold up progress and hold up reform. Sometimes a judge's restrained decision is something that we need to keep things going the way that they are. But I want you to think about ways that a judge's decision could change things. And you can look at two related court decisions that you studied in history. think about the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson and what kind of situation in society that created. And then I want you to think about Brown versus Board of Education, which was another Supreme Court case. It made a huge sweeping change with the decision that was made. Try and connect these cases to these ideas of judicial activism and judicial restraint, and bring some ideas and some questions to class, and we'll talk about them when we get together on this.